Blood satellite.
But I saw this really fascinating article here. Group chats rule the world. And we've talked about this before, about how everyone calls little group chats echo chambers, and we need to break people out of these echo chambers. But I think the previous social media model of an individual broadcasting to the world, first of all, that doesn't exist anymore. But second of all, it only really existed for a very brief amount of time, and maybe even only with Twitter. But the trend for online communities has become smaller and smaller with higher and higher walls. And we're seeing something like a salon culture spring up. And arguably that's been going on forever. But I think the walls are higher than ever before. And there's more and more people who just filter everything, all their news, all their gossip, everything through the community. And I think so no one's just plugged in to a feed. People tend to be leaving feeds more than ever before because the feeds are garbage. Algorithmic programming is fucking shit. You watch one video from something you hate and now your entire feed is things you hate.
Yep.
Twitter even does this. I saw one tweet from like Will Stancil, and now it's all Will Stancil's friends on my feed. I don't subscribe to any of these people. I've just got like left anarchists complaining about people complaining about Furiosa or shit like that. Like, this isn't the experience that I want. So this is from Saram Krishnan.
What the Sigma?
You know what? Fuck it. Put a bullet in my head. But let's just read it anyway. It says, most of the interesting conversations in tech now happen in private group chats. WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal, small invite-only Discord groups. Discord could probably even be said to be the first big push for this. Being part of the right group chat can feel like having a peek at the kitchen of a restaurant, but instead of food, messy ideas and gossip fly around in real time. Salons and groups have always existed, but why the recent shift to private discourse? And he gives a few reasons here. I think these are true, but I think the history of this reaches back further. But he says, the great culture wars of 2020 meant people, especially in tech, weren't comfortable sharing their views in public. 2, COVID meant we all had to shelter indoors and turned online for community. 3, many of the big internet trends of recent years, crypto and AI, started or found homes in small online communities first. I know that's true in crypto. Most of the crypto space is run by these like weird little chats. And I know, like, I'd heard stories from some of my friends in finance during COVID because no one knew what the fuck was going on. COVID was breaking everything everywhere. And so what you saw spring up were these like Zoom calls and these private chats where like finance guys were getting together saying, okay, what do you know? What do I know? Let's just figure out how we can make it so we don't all go broke, right? And then over time, these started to snowball into these like weekly happenings where you get bigger and bigger names come in. But these were not public. They weren't even online. They're just like Zoom calls where like policymakers would just pop in along with kind of low level guys. And that was just in finance. So imagine that happening everywhere, because I assume it was. And it was also happening, on a lower level in marketing too. I knew people trying to like, when people don't know what to do, they host salons. When the world's falling apart, they'll say, let me get 15 guys together and let's talk about what the fuck's going on, because no one wants to do it on the timeline anymore. That's for certain. He says here, time and time again, I've seen group chat conversations act as the mimetic upstream of mainstream opinion. Like a stand-up comic workshopping his set in a small club, people trial content and ideas, find bonds, and you'll often see narratives and ideas discussed make the jump to X and then to mainstream discourse. I think that's true. And that was even true with memes where, back in the day, memes would start on 4chan or any of the Chan boards. And then the ultimate destination was like E-Bombs World and then Facebook. But there was this filtration process all along the way. But none of these people were making memes. The people who made the memes were in these like really these tight-knit communities that were a bit more hostile to outsiders. And I'm talking about 4chan here. It's not like it was this private group, but there was a time when 4chan was seen as a place where regular people didn't want to go. But they're the ones who are making things, and they're making things on something awful. So I think this has been a model that's been defining the internet for a long time. So anyway, what do we think about that? Does that ring true to you at all?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and so he says, which leads to the question, what makes one of these groups work? He says the best ones are a forever dinner party, good friends, and conversation happening in perpetuity. They share some of the things below. It says gardener, not carpenter, strong and fair central leader who sets the tone and enforces the rules. Number 2 is cooling rods and nuclear reactors. It says cooling rods are used in nuclear reactors to control the rate of reaction. Every group chat usually has 1 or 2 people that like to talk a lot. I'm just thinking of our own right now, and a couple names spring up. They are critical. You need the provocateurs who inject new ideas consistently. However, almost all of them have a tendency to dominate these groups. This is where cooling rods come in. This is someone who can just shut them down. Like you need power users, but you need like 2 other cooling users to calm them the fuck down. And again, if people are thinking of our chat right now, you might actually see this at play. Any chat that you've been a part of that is successful, it's not even a natural thing. It's not like this is how human beings necessarily exist in the real world. But the chat dynamic, like you don't have a power user in your friend group, a guy who just never shuts up, because then he wouldn't be in your friend group, right?
Yeah.
But a chat is an interesting dynamic because you pop in and out. So a guy can be talking for hours and hours. You pop in, but if you're hanging out with someone and if they never stop talking, you throw them in the bonfire. But in this case, you actually need these people, and you can't kill them because then everything dies. He says the gravitational pull of a few topics. It's common for a group chat to suffer from audience capture and start circling the same topics incessantly. This is where variety comes in. You need a consistent injection of new ideas, themes, and members into the mix. Anyway, he's just going through a few things here. But and we talked about the emancipation of authorship, that book a while ago. It's like even just being in these chats sometimes, by you speaking up, you could actually influence the discourse in more ways than you could ever imagine.
Yeah, for sure.
If you just find yourself in there, you don't actually need to publish anything. You could actually get the ear of someone, and now you might be affecting public policy.
Yeah, you know what? Just as that bit about fuck, what was it? We mentioned a minute ago. Oh, I lost. Anyways, I made a point that you said that you really liked, and I thought I got it from you. I remember I didn't get it from you. I got it from a random guy in a voluntarist group chat. So the point is that this is what I'm talking like. There's maybe 15 guys in those comments, and I pulled his comment, gave it to you. You loved it. Now it's on our show.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
this is the point. Like this shit spreads. You don't really know how it's going to affect people.
Yeah, and on that topic, and this is why I wanted to start with that, because it leads into this video that I watched, and I'll include some clips here. But there's this guy that everyone's probably heard of, and I just figured out about. But it's the video was called Reddit is a Psyop, and the creator is Flesh Simulator. And this guy's a great guy. He's got you would love this guy. He's got a good few conspiracy videos. But the title is Reddit's a Psyop, and you hear that. People say that all the fucking time. But what do they really mean? And I'll briefly summarize the video here because it's a lot deeper than you would think at the outset. But it has to do with AI. So everyone has heard the news that there's certain AI constructs that are being fed information from Reddit. Reddit just hooks right into them, so it's building an artificial intelligence made from Reddit posts.
Well, guess what? Reddit just made a big deal with a mysterious AI company that wants to use Reddit's data to train its algorithms. That means the AI company will have access to millions of posts and comments made by Reddit users every day. The AI company is paying Reddit a lot of money for this privilege, around $60 million per year, according to some sources. Why would they do that? Well,
because Google had their own AI, and the controversy was that people were submitting questions to the AI as they would a search engine, and it was coughing up insane answers.
Can cockroaches live in your penis? Absolutely. It's totally normal too. Usually, over the course of a year, 5 to 10 cockroaches will crawl into your penis hole while you are asleep. This is how they got the name cockroach.
It was like telling people to kill themselves. It was saying like fucking beavers were made of lead. Just nonsense, right? because it's just repeating memes. Like, you feed Reddit information and it's going to come out insane and gay, of course. But some people think that that's just a weird, random thing that happened. Like, why would they do that? So he goes, the Flesh Simulator, he goes into the history of there was this Reddit end of year survey that they had to take down. And the reason was they said something that they shouldn't have said. They released some data that they shouldn't have released. And the data was, the most popular cities in America, in like concentrated cities for Reddit users, Reddit power users even. And it was like this, it turns out the number one was this like weird military base.
In 2014, Reddit's year-end blog post had to be taken down and edited, after it turns out they didn't exactly vet the analytics data for accidentally including the truth. Now, this post has long since been deleted, presumably for totally legitimate and completely unrelated reasons, but thankfully we can find the original version on the Internet Archive. Well, until that gets shut down too, at least. Most Reddit-addicted city with over 100,000 visitors. Huh, Eglin Air Force Base. Well, I mean, that makes sense. It's an Air Force base. I'm sure they're, all on Reddit a lot. I'm adding this line because of the people who were treating this like a gotcha last time I tried to post a video on this topic. Anyways, hang on a second. How many people are there at Eglin? 2,448? And wait a second. Most Reddit-addicted city with more than how many visitors? 100,000? That's at least 97,000. Too many visitors! So, what kind of stuff goes on at Eglin? Let's take a look at some of the organizations there. Eglin is home to the 688th Cyberspace Wing, the 690th Cyberspace Operations Group, and the 692nd Cyberspace Operations Squadron. Then, as part of the Air Force Test Center, 96th Test Wing, there is the 96th Cyberspace Test Group, including the 47th and 48th Cyberspace Test Squadrons.
Like the number one, the place that made the most posts, and everyone's like, well, what the fuck's that about? They're like, nothing. But it turned out that there's a lot of weird experiments. There's a lot of like weird conversations that happen on Reddit, gaslighting, the Mandela effect stuff, where you'll see in communities like people will claim an event never happened for some reason, and just to see if they could build a consensus around it, right? And there's been some examples of this, and he goes in the video. So then you realize, like, okay, what is the circuit here? The circuit is AI giving answers to random people. Now, they wanted to feed in Reddit because they think Reddit's just a balanced, leveled communication platform for regular people. But this was just a roundabout way for the fucking CIA and the intelligence community to influence Reddit, so then Reddit could influence AI. So what was really happening is the CIA is controlling what is the truth for artificial intelligence.
Right.
And so people think, well, it seems kind of stupid that you would let Reddit become the main feed for this. Well, no. Once you realize that the experiment was actually to see, how can we socially engineer Reddit? How can we like make up alternative histories, brainwash people, and gaslight them, and then make that into reality through an AI which people implicitly trust because they think the AI is smarter than any human being. Like, it can only say the truth. But this was an experiment to see if we could redefine the truth. So, and that's what interested me about the topic of these digital salons, which is like, this is kind of the only way to combat that. It's a filtration system that I think it's the only sort of filtration system that could probably beat the CIA communicating to everyone through AI. Because we're getting to the point where no one's going to trust AI at all, because they're just aware that it's just the lies told to them fed back to them.
Well, I mean, public AI, like nobody's going to trust AI that's coming from Google or from Open or from any of these other companies. Yeah.
Well, once you introduce the concept of like this circuit where the lie can be introduced from an unpredictable angle, I think everything is just off the table at that point. It's like, wait, why am I even trusting this? Oh, it's all up to the data that's fed. Do I trust who's seeing the data?
That's what I mean. Sorry, that's what I should have said that. That's what I mean is like you can't trust AI if AI is just an amalgamation of the data set. But if the data, they want to say, oh, the data, we try to pick a broad data set. No, you fucking handpicked it specifically to change the narrative. So I can't trust any AI where the data set is opaque. You know, if my adversary is picking the data set, why on earth would I trust that?
Yeah, it's such a strange, again, it's a process where it's like, it's so far from like, we're going to make an artificial intelligence. It's like, no, we're manufacturing consent for people, and those people are being conglomerated in the AI and then fed back to the people.
Yeah,
like it's such a more twisted version than we're going to create a super intelligence. Well, how you do that is like, if you model that off of people who've been lied to.
Yeah. And then the same neural net technology is probably being used to generate the posts on social media and Reddit as well. So it's all incestuous at this point. This is the thing that we raised the flag on this 18 months ago. I think I was sitting in this chair like 2 Christmases ago talking about this in terms of Midjourney and Stable Diffusion, that you're eventually going to reach a situation where there are multiple layers of different actors all using AI, feeding into AI, and some of them are doing it unwittingly, and you're going to end up with just an absolute mud pit of garbage everywhere, and you can't trust anything. And yeah, here we go. Let's fucking go.
And you know what, this is, a lot of people will say this feels like the moments before like we break the sound barrier into some new hyper travel. So, you know, this is our approach to the singularity, as Ray Kurzweil would say. This could also be interpreted as the final death gasps of civilization, if you wanted to view it from the perspective that we just gave.
That's so much more likely.
And that it ties into this book that I read recently. And this is a book that I'd had on my list for quite some time, and it was highly recommended. And a lot of people have read this already, but it kept getting shuffled to the back of the line because over time we were reading more books that had to do with lost civilizations and archaeology and the collapse of civilizations. This one, the one I'm talking about, is The Collapse of Complex Civilizations by Joseph A. Tainter. A lot of people love this book, but I'm like, well, we talked about Rome, we talked about the Mongols, we've done our investigations in history. Like, is this just going to repeat the same things? And I wish I'd read this earlier because I absolutely love this book, and there was a lot more in it than I gave it credit for at the outset. There's a lot of examples in this and a lot of detail that has been given. And it ties into what we were just talking about, which is that it's when people talk about the collapse of complex societies, the operative word is complex. And it seems to be the complexity itself that leads to it. And we had discussed the Bronze Age collapse. I believe it was 1177 by Eric Klein. And his description was of the Bronze Age, you know, the area around Egypt, what caused that collapse, because it was a complex system interlocked with trade and relationships and communication for the time. And it wasn't one thing that caused the collapse, because some people say, it was an invasion of the sea peoples, or it was earthquakes, or it was famine. The problem was it was actually all of them together, because to destroy a complex society, you need a complex sequence of events, because any one thing a complex society can usually overcome. A complex society can overcome a famine. It can overcome an enemy or a conquest. So it's never one thing. You actually need quite a few things. But he makes the argument in the book that the complexity and the demands of a complex system, the demands for energy, make it a bit more susceptible to internal problems.
What I focused on in the Collapse book was how complexity grows to solve problems or to take advantage of opportunities. And complexity always has an economic cost. As I said, we mostly pay for it today through energy, through fossil fuels. So we're largely unaware of that. But the economic cost is still there. And as the complexity of a society increases, it comes to cost more and more per capita. And in past societies, we saw this increasing to the point where complexity was simply no longer feasible.
I'll just start with his quote here. It says, "Many, of course, prefer to believe that modern civilization, with its scientific and technological capacity, its energy resources, and its knowledge of economics and history, should be able to survive whatever crisis ancient and simpler societies found insurmountable. But how firm is this belief? Many persons who have had some awareness of history no doubt harbor the suspicion that civilization can die because it's already died once. A society has collapsed, because what is a collapse? When people think of a collapse, they think of, Fallout. They think of The Road by Cormac McCarthy. They think of like a total decimation of the resources and people are wandering. Really, it's just like the Wild West. That's what we think about when we think of collapse. The Wild West, but gray. But he redefines collapse in a way that I think is more practical, and this is the one I'm going to use going forward. He says, a society has collapsed when it displays a rapid, significant loss of an established level of socio-political complexity. To qualify as an instance of collapse, a society must have been at or developing towards a level of complexity for more than 1 or 2 generations.
If you read physics or if you read biology, you'll see complexity used in different ways. I use complexity to mean, as I've suggested, 2 things. The first is differentiation and specialization in structure and in function or behavior. What this means is more parts and more kinds of parts as societies become more complex. The second is increasing integration and control of behavior, so that as a society grows to have more parts and more kinds of parts, there has to be mechanisms that bind those together to function as a whole, to make a system. Without integration, without organization, you don't have a system. You simply have an assemblage of parts.
The demise of the Carolingian Empire, thus, is not a case of collapse, merely an unsuccessful attempt at nation building and empire building. He says, a society that has collapsed is suddenly smaller, less differentiated and heterogeneous, and characterized by fewer specialized parts. It displays less social differentiation and is able to exercise less control over the behavior of its members. It is able at the same time to command smaller surpluses or offer fewer benefits to membership, and it is less capable of providing subsistence. It may decompose to some of the constituent building blocks like states or ethnic groups or villages out of which it was created. So that's the way I like to view collapse. It's like a step down. A collapse doesn't mean there's nothing there, even though that has happened with some empires, but it's more like you're broken down into the component parts, which is actually what happened after the fall of the Roman Empire. You had the people kind of regress into towns and villages and diasporas, but they kind of came back and sometimes kept living in the ruins sometimes. But anyway,
I don't know why I've never heard it described that way, but yeah, it's like people conflate collapse with like extinction. But it's exactly what it is. Collapse just means it's not collapse of the species, it's collapse of the civilization, like the cultures and the mores and the practices and the institutions. That's what collapses. There's not nothing left. There's just a different thing that's simpler and smaller.
Yeah, it's like you could live in a nation and maybe collapse means you just revert back to city states and towns and villages.
Exactly.
And then maybe you build back up again, but it's just like a step down in complexity, which is what I think will likely happen in Canada because our current complex interlocking of provinces just
totally
seems unsustainable.
Yeah.
But that's why people are talking about fracturing the United States. Like the United States would collapse, but it would still be the states. There would still be Texas, and maybe new relationships would be brokered. But collapse doesn't mean that America becomes a crater, And he says even simple societies can lose an established level of complexity just as great empires. Like sedentary horticulturists may become mobile foragers and lose the socio-political trappings of village life. A region organized under a central chieftain administration may lose its hierarchical umbrella. And revert to independent feuding villages. A group of the foragers themselves may be distressed by environmental deterioration and then just go their separate ways entirely. These are cases of collapse, no less than the end of Rome and no less significant for their respective populations. And he gives a couple examples here just because people always think of Rome, and Rome is a fantastic example. But there's so many examples, and I'm going to get into a couple here. There's one that I love from Africa that I'd never heard of before. But he says here, like the Harappian or Indus Valley civilization existed in northwestern India, perhaps as early as 2400 BC. It was apparently dominated by two major cities. Both were established according to similar designs. A fortified citadel on the western side with civic and religious buildings, and a lower urban zone with standardized streets. Yet by roughly 1750 BC, this regional uniformity and centralized control had broken down. In urban centers, the standardization of street frontages declined. Brickwork was less careful. Bricks from older buildings were reused in new ones. Pottery kilns became, for the first time, built within city walls. Expressive art became simpler. Hordes of jewelry were stashed away. Groups of unburied corpses were left lying in the streets. And then you saw the slow decline that way by its markers. The Minoan civilization is another example. The Minoan civilization of Crete was the first in Europe. The earliest palaces on the island were built soon after 2000 BC. They were thereafter repeatedly destroyed by earthquakes, and up until the final collapse, they were each time rebuilt more splendidly than before. The Minoans possessed advanced knowledge of architecture, engineering, drainage, and hydraulics. The Mycenaean civilization of mainland Greece became a serious trade competitor. Security declined as militarism increased. By 1380 BC, the Cretan palaces were finally destroyed, and then most were not rebuilt. Minoan civilization collapsed. Political, economic, and administrative centralization declined. And again, aside from Rome, the Hopewell complex developed in the last 1 or 2 centuries BC and the first 4 centuries AD in the Great Lakes Rivian area of the Midwest. Hopewell is distinguished by such features as the construction of large earthworks requiring mobilization and coordination of labor. By perhaps 400 AD, the regional constellation of localized Hopewellian societies had everywhere collapsed. The succeeding late woodland period is marked by a curtailment in trade, mortuary ceremonialism, public construction, and complexity. So you see these things start to decline in complexity, even represented in the art and their great public works. Now, I love this one. This one is so cool because I never heard of it before. And anytime I hear people like talking about the vitality of tribal societies and the masculinity of the societies, and what would you call it? A true rebellion against the matriarchy. I think of this. These are the Ik people. It's spelled I-K. The Ik people of northern Uganda. I'm just going to read this. This really doesn't even fit an example of a complex civilization, but I don't do much reading in African tribes, and this one blew my fucking mind. So the Ik people of northern Uganda live at what must surely be the extreme of deprivation and disaster. Due to drought and disruption by national boundaries of the traditional cycle of movement, the Ik live in such a food and water scarce environment that there's absolutely no advantage to reciprocity or social sharing. So there's no community whatsoever. They are so highly fragmented that most activities, especially subsistence, are pursued individually. Each Ik will spend days or weeks on his or her own searching for food and water. Their motivation for marriage or cohabitation is that one can't build a house alone. The members of a conjugal pair forage alone and do not share food. Indeed, their foraging is so independent that if both members happen to be in their residence together, it's by accident. Although little is known about how they got to their present situation, there are some indications of former organizational patterns. They possess clan names, although today these have no structural significance. They live in villages, but these no longer have any political meaning. They're just like houses that happen to be side by side. And it's like that the mothers raise their kids for like right away. The kids are almost like left to their own devices. It's fucking crazy. But
how are they alive? That's like the very next step of civilization, just above a gorilla.
Yeah.
Like that. How? Like I don't even know how you're alive. That's wild.
I do think gorillas might have more of a community than that.
True.
Because at that point, like if you're at that level of subsistence living, like someone must have said, we got to get out of here. we got to walk that direction until we find water. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
I don't care if we become slaves at that level. Like, you might as well become a slave.
Yeah.
It's like, well, you know, I don't want to work, but I'd like water. I'd like some meat once in a while.
Yeah.
Maybe being raped is better than being with this fucking bitch. And there's a sequence to how these things tend to collapse. It says, there is first and foremost a breakdown of authority and central control. Prior to collapse, revolts and provincial breakaways signal the weakening of the center. Revenues to the government often decline. Foreign challengers become increasingly successful. With lower revenues, the military may become ineffective. The populace becomes more and more disaffected as the hierarchy seeks to mobilize resources to meet the challenge. With disintegration, central direction is no longer possible. The former political center undergoes a significant loss of prominence and power. It's often ransacked and may ultimately be abandoned. Small petty states emerge in the formerly unified territory of which previous capitals may be done. Quite often these contend for domination. What populations remain in urban or other political centers reuse existing architecture in a characteristic manner. Like, does this sound familiar? Does this sound familiar to anyone?
Yeah.
The difficulty with complexity is that it always costs. Whether we are talking about organisms as they evolve to become more complex, or societies as they evolve to become more complex. In past societies, the problem was that complexity would increase beyond the point that was sustainable with the solar energy that ultimately supported them. We have to remember that they didn't have the fossil fuel energy we have today. So ultimately they reached the point where the complexity of their societies could not be sustained on the basis of solar energy, on the basis of agriculture. When I look at the industrialized world today and try to project how it might develop over the next few decades, what I see are a large number of very expensive problems converging at once.
And then in the process of collapse, organization reduces to the lowest level that is economically sustainable, so that a variety of contending polities exist where there had been once peace and unity. Remaining populations must become locally self-sufficient to a degree not seen for several generations. Groups that had formerly been economic and political partners now become strangers, even threatening competitors. The citizens of modern complex societies usually do not realize that we are in an anomaly of history. Throughout several million years that recognizable humans are known to have lived, the common political unit was a small autonomous community acting independently and largely self-sufficient. Two concepts important to understanding the nature of complexity are inequality and heterogeneity. Inequality may be thought of as vertical differentiation, ranking, and unequal access to resources. Heterogeneity is a subtler concept. It refers to the number of distinctive parts or components to a society, at the same time the ways in which a population is distributed amongst these parts. States tend to be overwhelmingly concerned with maintaining their territorial integrity. This is indeed one of their primary characteristics. States are the only kind of human society that does not ordinarily undergo short-term cycles of formation and dissolution. I think that's an interesting way of putting it. Like, states are the only things that think they can kind of live forever, or think that they don't need to sacrifice anything to renew themselves, whereas the community kind of understands that. And that's what we were talking about before with the idea of the chat being this sort of organism. Like the chat is like an entity that must be maintained by a gardener rather than a dictator. You need to cycle in new ideas, new blood carefully, right? But otherwise it stagnates. And so to our communities, right? But once it gets at a sufficient level of complexity, it's like you begin to think that you can exist outside of life and death itself, and the state stops believing that it needs to refresh itself in any way. And that's what tends to lead to collapse as it clings to power over time. And he gets in that right here. He says, despite an institutionalized authority structure, an ideological basis, and a monopoly on force, the rulers of states share at least one thing in common with chiefs and the big men: the need to establish and consistently reinforce legitimacy. In complex as well as simpler societies, leadership activities and social resources must be continuously devoted to this purpose. Hierarchy and complexity, as noted, are rare and when present require constant reinforcement. No societal leader is ever far from the need to validate the position of their relevance. Legitimacy is the belief of the populace and the elites that the rule is proper and valid, that the political world is as it should be. And usually during a collapse, that's the first thing to fail. And again, does that sound familiar? Does this sound in our current society that there is no legitimacy to the government? I would argue that there's been no legitimacy since, the past few decades, since the fucking 70s, really. Does anyone believe in the government? No.
Yeah.
He just goes into some description here about the various types of early states. I think is also interesting here. He says these two individuals, Klestin and Skalnick, distinguish various types of early states. These are the inchoate early state. In this type, kinship, family, and community ties still dominate the relations. The next one is the typical early state, where kinship in this variety is balanced by ties to locality, competition, and counterbalance heredity, leading to administrative roles that are allocated to non-kinsmen and redistribution of reciprocity. Then the third one is the transactional or the transitional early state. Kinship in this final category affects only marginal aspects of the government. The administrative apparatus is dominated by appointed officials and market economies, and overtly antagonistic social structures develop with the emergence of private ownership and the means of production. So in each step of this, you actually get further and further away from the kinship network. And the only ways you see that still relevant in society is in like secret societies and dynastic families. Those are the people who tend to have power in the society, in these legacy families, but you're not supposed to admit that either. But it does seem in that sense that the kin network remains, and the kinship community is the most powerful orientation for your own survival in any system. It's just that they tend to build a complex system around themselves in a sense. And, a few different authors have come up with reasons for why these collapses occur. It says a number of authors have synthesized the different theories formulated to account for the origin of the state. So why do these kinship networks, why do these tribes and these families eventually become a state? What would drive them to want to do that? He says here, one drive is managerial. He says, as societies come under stress or as populations increase in numbers, integrative requirements may arise that can be resolved by the emergence of managerial hierarchies. The second is internal conflict. Theories within the school postulate that a class conflict is a prime mover behind complexity. Many of the Marxist thinkers believe this, that it is the only reason society exists is because of some kind of class conflict driving it. The other third option is external conflict. This one guy, Carnero, argues that it's circumscribed environments. This is the geopolitics angle. These stresses lead to conflict, while success at war necessitates the development of institutions to administer and administrate conquered groups. The last and fourth one is synthetic. Several interrelated processes generate complexity in state institutions. Colin Renfrew, for example, cites the influence of agriculture on social organization or societal factors on craft production and so forth. So there's no clear consensus on what drives one group to become a state eventually. It's probably all of them, frankly, because each civilization is fundamentally different. Like the Indian civilization is different than the Aztec civilization, is different than the Russian civilization currently. So, And furthermore, he says there appear to be 11 major themes in the explanation for collapse. So we talked about what causes states to form. There's 11 ways that they tend to collapse. These are, number one, depletion or cessation of a vital resource or resources of which they depend. 2, the establishment of a new resource base. 3, the occurrence of some insurmountable catastrophe, maybe a meteor strike, maybe a huge earthquake. 4, insufficient response to circumstances. 5, other complex societies, 6 intruders, 7 class conflict, 8 social dysfunction, 9 mystical factors, 10 chance concentration of events, and 11 economic factors. And even with catastrophes, he says complex. He actually goes into detail on why he doesn't think each one of these is sufficient to explain it. He says, for example, catastrophes. Complex societies regularly provide for catastrophes and routinely experience them. So yeah, catastrophes happen all the time. One of the reasons you form a complex society is to weather catastrophes. So it would need to be like whatever that sunk Atlantis. That would be one example. But failing that, or a meteor strike, or some kind of other flood, usually that's not a great example. For his part, what he thinks leads more often to societal collapse, and we've discussed this at the start, is complexity itself. And he goes into that here, and this could be the last part we end on. And I do think this is true, and it actually captures and explains a lot of the other, what people think to be causes. He says, not only is energy flow required to maintain a socio-political system, but the amount of energy must be sufficient for the complexity of that system. The amount of energy required per capita to maintain the simplest human institutions are incredibly small compared to those needed by the most complex. As societies increase in complexity, more networks are created among individuals, more hierarchical controls are created to regulate those networks, more information is processed, there is more centralization of information flow, there is increasing need to support specialists not directly involved in resource production to account for all this information. Think of the legal apparatus, think of the bureaucracy. More specifically, it is proposed that in many crucial spheres, continued investment in this complexity reaches a point where the benefits of such an investment begin to decline and gradually then accelerate a force. So really, as you increase in complexity, you need more institutions to justify that complexity. You need more resources for that, and you reach a tipping point of some kind where no one gets any benefit out of these institutions. Again, does that sound familiar? Does that sound like we are living in this machine and we don't know why we're doing these things anymore, and it just seems to create misery? It creates alienation. It creates deterritorialization. That is the primary marker of collapse, because you need increasing amounts of energy just to sustain this, and no one knows why they want to sustain it anymore, and that causes all the internal rebellions. And someone on Twitter had said this. It was probably one of the MAGA people, and they had proposed an open-ended question, an engagement farming question. The question was something like, can you name one problem with capitalism? Like, what, of course, he's trying to get 20,000 replies. And I just said one without getting into it. I'm like, capitalism seems to be the most effective at generating enemies to itself. If we are to understand that capitalism is the most advanced and efficient form of resource allocation, let's just grant that. It's undeniable that it seems to generate the most enemies, the most internal enemies to itself. And I believe that any system that generates more enemies to itself than, defenders, that is a broken system, whether you like it or not. So that's kind of the system we're in right now. Like, we inhabit a civilization that is extremely good at generating people that hate that civilization. Yeah. And regardless of how we ended up there, that itself, I think, is what will spell the end of the civilization. Because at the end of the day, who is going to be there to defend it? Even Republicans don't even seem to want to defend it anymore. The only people who really want to defend this system are new immigrants who actually don't want to defend the system. They're just operating their self-interest. So there's almost no one here who's really defending, like, the American electorate or the Canadian, Commonwealth right now.
Even if you look at the nature of the type of politicians we have on both sides in every party, is what you could say are grifters, or they're people who are free of principle. They're people who are only there because they're playing the game. So the corollary of that is that where are all the people who were principled in previous generations? Like, there used to be a draw to get involved because there was a possibility of you actually improving things and pulling things together. But the only people left, those of us who actually have principles and want a better future, none of us are involved in politics, really, because the system doesn't exist for that. It is what it does, and we know that that's not what it does. So
Yeah, and he just really puts a bow on it here. He says, it is suggested that the increased costs of socio-political evolution frequently reach a point of diminishing marginal returns. That is to say, the benefit investment ratio of socio-political complexity follows the marginal product curve in figure 1. I'll put this up in the video. He says, after a certain point, increased investments in complexity fail to yield proportionally increasing returns. Marginal returns decline and marginal costs rise. Complexity as a strategy becomes increasingly costly and yields decreasing marginal benefits. That's just a simple way of putting it, I think. It says Gregory Johnson has shown graphically that as the size of a social group increases, the communication load increases even faster. Information processing increases in response until capacity is reached. After this point, information processing performance deteriorates so that greater costs are allocated to processing that is less efficient and reliable. At this point, information processing hierarchies may be expected to develop. In the same vein, Moore has suggested that when the amount of information processed by society is small, much can be collected at low cost. As this amount of information spreads, however, the marginal cost of useful information grows rapidly, in part because redundancy of information increases. So there's more information, more laws, more rules, more data than ever before. But the cost of processing it, that's what fucking AI is. AI is us trying to make sense of this information-driven world and that we can't make sense of it anymore. So we're going to try and create a super intelligence that can cough up something that has utility. That used to be search engines, then search engines became corrupted by useless information through search engine optimization, otherwise known as SEO, and the content revolution, which I was unfortunately a part of. Sorry, but that's how we need a fucking magic bullet of some kind to make sense of everything. He says here, some people I think will agree with this, some people might not, but he says modern science is becoming less productive overall because it has become increasingly specialized and expensive and has depleted much of the stock of less costly questions. This costly science certainly produces astonishing results, but these cannot be claimed to be more valuable than the generalized knowledge of earlier, less expensive science. Early archaeology established the parameters of the field, defined regional and temporal variation, and did a remarkably good job of setting out the basic rules. More recent, highly funded archaeology, asserts one critic, has not been successful in answering a single major research question. I think that's true. He says here, the appeasement of urban mobs presents the classical illustration of this principle. Any level of activities undertaken to appease such populations eventually becomes the expected minimum. An increase in the cost of bread in circuses, which seems to have been required in imperial Rome to legitimize such things as the accession of a new ruler or his continued reign, may bring no increased return beyond the state of non-revolt. Rewards to Roman military personnel would often follow the same pattern, particularly when bounties were granted upon a ruler's succession. Roman soldiers regarded such bounties as a right. So that's interesting. Like the things you use to put down a revolution became expected going forward. And so the demands and the expectations of the population just increase over time just to keep them quiet from rebelling against something else in the system that caused them to rebel. Does that sound like, I don't know, black people? Does that sound like immigrants? Does that sound like most groups in America? Basically, everyone's saying, like, pay me money right now or I'm going to burn your city down. I know some people, you know, it's easy to believe if you've been sitting in this boiling pot for long enough that that's normal. It's not normal to shake down the government constantly. Society used to be that people wanted to be inside of it. It's actually not normal to live in a civilization where everyone wants to burn it down all the fucking time. And the only way you won't is if you get like more free crypto or whatever. Anyway, that's what I wanted to just finish on that I really like the thesis that the cause of complex civilizations collapsing is complexity itself and the demands of complexity, and the belief in states that complexity is their shield, that complexity is the evolution that will withstand entropy, whereas it seems to invite entropy. And the only way to really sustain that complexity is, and he says this in the book, is almost exponentially increasing the amount of energy put into it. This is usually done through conquest. Even George Bataille would say you need to burn it off with sacrifices and whatnot, because the surplus suffocates you eventually. We discussed that earlier on too. The accursed share was what the book was called. But basically, it's this idea that complexity means an antidote to entropy, and complexity makes you invincible. And I think it's quite the opposite. And I don't think states are really prepared to reckon with that. Before we go, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, no, I mean it's kind of crazy how this perfectly describes exactly what we're living through right now. It's impressive.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.